Welcome to Author Stories, the podcast where we talk to the best writers in the industry and discuss writing and the creative process. Whether you're a writer, a reader, or both, we hope you'll find something here that makes you love books and the writers that create them. You can find archives of all of the great conversations I've had with authors over the years at hankgarner.com. Take some time and browse around there. I'm sure you'll find a new author to love, find inspiration for your own creative life, and find a new story to get lost in. My guest today is Christopher Ingraham. We're talking about his book, If You Lived Here, You'd Be Home by Now, and the hilarious story that brought this book about. I think you're really going to like this. Before we talk to Christopher, let's hear from some sponsors that make the show possible. Jasper T. Scott. His box set, Dark Space, the complete series. This is 6 books bundled together, on sale now for 99 cents. 6 complete books, over 600,000 copies sold. More than 2,000 pages of epic space opera for the low price of 99 cents. Also available in Kindle Unlimited if you're a Kindle Unlimited subscriber. Humanity is defeated. 10 years ago, the Scythians invaded the galaxy with one goal: to wipe out the human race. Now the survivors are hiding in the last human sector of the galaxy, Dark Space, once a place of exile for criminals, now the last refuge of mankind. The once galaxy-spanning Imperium of star systems is left guarding the gate, which is the only way in or out of Dark Space, but not everyone is satisfied with their governance. Freelancer and ex-convict Ethan Ortain is on the run. He owes crime lord Alec Barandi 10,000 souls, and his ship is badly damaged. When Brandi catches up with him, he makes an offer Ethan can't refuse. Ethan must infiltrate and sabotage the Valiant, the Imperial Star System's fleet carrier which stands guarding the entrance of Dark Space, and then his debt will be cleared. While Ethan is still undecided about what he'll do, he realizes that the Imperium has been lying and putting all of Dark Space at risk. Now Brandi's plan is starting to look like a necessary evil, but before Ethan can act on it, he discovers that the real plan was much more sinister than what he was told, and he will be lucky to escape the Valiant alive. Grab all 6 books for 99 cents right now. Dark Space, the complete series by Jasper T. Scott. The Unwelcome Trilogy by R.D. Brady. Survivor, Mother, Leader, and Humanity's Last Chance. Deep within the remnants of the United States, Lila Richards oversees a camp of 200 survivors. In a world where living is an everyday struggle, and only through banding together can people survive, the arrival of the unwelcome only made her job harder. Riley Quinn and Miles Jones have been raised by Lila for the last 5 years. They're also one of the cursed, the children between the ages of 13 and 18, whom the unwelcome kill on sight. No questions, no pleas, just death. Protecting one another and the people of their camp is ingrained in all of them. But now each of them faces increased danger as the reason why the cursed have been targeted by the unwelcome slowly comes to light. And that truth will shock them to their core. Now time is running out, not just for the cursed who are being hunted down by the unwelcome, not just for Lila and her family who will face the greatest challenge yet, but for all of humanity. The world changed radically 35 years ago, but today humanity's very existence is on the line, and the fight has begun that will ensure its future or its annihilation. Fans of A.G. Riddle, James Rollins, Suzanne Collins, and Brandon Sanderson will love the Unwelcome Trilogy. Pick up your copy of the Unwelcome Trilogy on Amazon today. Edge of Valor, a military sci-fi thriller by Josh Hayes. When their mission fails, his begins. David Weber calls it a tour de force. Special Agent Jackson Fisher is a man after truth. When a military operation to extract a high-ranking ambassador from the war-torn border world of Stonemaier ends in disaster, Fisher is called in to investigate. A whole platoon went in, but only 3 Alliance Marines returned home. The rest killed in action along with hundreds of civilians. With tensions between the Holloman Alliance and Stonemaier rising, Fisher attempts to stitch the pieces together. One thing becomes more and more certain. The surviving Marines are lying. As the truth unfurls, Fisher begins to realize this was far more than a simple rescue mission, and that the truth might be something best left buried. Filled with action, mystery, and well-crafted characters, Edge of Valor, the Valor series Book 1, will put you into a world of war, conspiracy, and betrayal. It's perfect for fans of David Weber's Honorverse or Tom Clancy's Jack Ryan with a futuristic flair. That's Edge of Valor by Josh Hayes. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have my guest, Christopher Ingraham, on the show with me today. He has a fantastic new book. It's called If You Lived Here, You'd Be Home by Now, Why We Traded the Commuting Life for a Little House on the Prairie. Guys, I absolutely love this book. I love the spirit behind the book and the story behind it, which we're going to get into in just a little bit. Welcome to the show, Christopher.
Hey, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining me. We begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, man. Okay, so this is probably going to go way back to my dad. So my dad was a small-town veterinarian, large animal and small animal. And he had always wanted to be a writer as well. He was kind of a frustrated writer. He published some articles in veterinary magazines, but he always wanted to write fiction. But he struggled with it, and he had such a hard time of it. And I remember when I was a kid, maybe 6 or 7, he was getting very much into the writing, and we had a new computer in the house. This was like 1987, so it was like a Tandy 1000 HX. And I remember seeing him there sitting in front of the computer, typing and writing away, and me thinking to myself, man, I want to do that too. And so I would, sit there and type things away about, just goofy sentences about whatever was happening to me in first or second grade that day or what have you. So if I have to look back to where the seed was planted, it was probably right around then. Oh, absolutely. Read a lot of books. I'm kind of fortunate that I grew up with books. Like video games came along later in my childhood. So like my early childhood was just basically all books. So I remember reading Lord of the Rings in third grade or something like that. I remember reading books about dinosaurs to my kindergarten class. So yeah, my parents were very into reading and instilling the value of reading into me as a kid.
You said your dad was a small town veterinarian. What part of the country was that?
So this is in upstate New York. It was a town called Oneonta. It's kind of near Cooperstown, the Baseball Hall of Fame, if that means anything to your listeners.
Sure. You started, or you now work for the Washington Post. What was your journey to journalism and to ultimately moving to Washington?
Oh man, it was about as circuitous a journey as you can imagine.
Those are the best.
I went to college at Cornell University. I was going to do something in biology. I had no idea what, but by that point I really liked biology. I went through about 5 different majors before settling on comparative religion, which was not like priesthood training, but just kind of a typical liberal arts major. From there, I went to grad school for a year at the University of California, Irvine. I was going to do an English PhD before I got out there, and I realized 2 things. A, that I hated Southern California, and B, that a PhD would take me 8 years and I would never get a job. So by this point, my then girlfriend and I, we were there a year, and we decided to cut our losses. We moved as far away from Southern California as we could, which was Vermont. And so we lived in Vermont for a few years, and I did a bunch of odd jobs. My first real actual writing job, which I just kind of ended up stumbling back into, was as a technical writer for a small software company. And I actually enjoyed that a lot. I found it really rewarding. There wasn't any of the writerly pressure to be creative or anything like that. You just had to be clear and concise and precise, and I loved that. It was great. Eventually, we ended up moving down to D.C. when my wife got recruited to work for the Social Security Administration. And so I started looking for a job down there, and lo and behold, this job comes up at the Pew Research Center, which is a think tank, a polling organization, and particularly in their project called the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. And I wrote to them, and they're like, wait a minute, you have a religion degree? And I'm like, wait a minute, you're a place that's looking for someone with a religion degree? So it was just kind of like this magical moment. So I worked there for a couple of years doing web writing and then also data stuff, and that's how I started doing data, survey data, and other sorts of data. From there, I went to the Brookings Institution, another think tank, doing more data-y kind of stuff. And then from there in 2014 to the Post when they had a need for people to work with data and to build stories around data. And that's where I'm still writing today.
So I love those kinds of stories. And when you say circuitous route, those are my absolute favorite. Because if you break any one of those links in that long chain, then Christopher doesn't end up where he is today, and we don't have this book to talk about.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
It's absolutely fascinating to me, the reasons and why we end up where we do and the things that we become involved with. Mm-hmm. Did you learn anything working like for Pew and in the Brookings Institute? Mm-hmm. Did you learn anything from working in organizations like that you look back on now and say that those informed or influenced the way that you tell the stories that you tell now?
Oh, absolutely. Just in terms of, working with data and being familiar with numbers. Like, I'm the kind of guy, I'm much more comfortable, digging through numbers in a spreadsheet than I am going out and, cold calling people for a story. Like, when I think of a story, I think of the numbers first. And if there's something I want to say, I think about how I'm going to anchor it with charts and figures and maps and things like that. To me, the data is like the heart of the story, and if I can get a human side to it as well, that's great. But for me, the data is really the core of it, and that's something that I really learned at both Pew and at the Brookings Institution.
Gotcha. When did you realize that that data could tell a human story? If you start looking at a lot of people get lost in statistics, and the missing piece is someone who can interpret that to something meaningful that we can then wrap our heads around and then use that information to make change or to just get a better understanding of the people around us and the places we live and work and things like that. At what point did the connection make for you that data could be something that helps us understand the world?
Oh, gosh. One of the really telling things for me, an anecdote I go back to, is at the Pew Research Center. We had some data on, this was back in, 2007, so, questions about torture were very big back then. And we had this data that actually looked at support for torture, actual torture was in the question wording, on terror suspects to use to get information out of them. And it was support for torture by religious affiliation, so among Catholics, Protestants, evangelical Protestants, non-believers. And one of the really interesting things there was that support for torture was actually highest among the most religious people, which was just a huge surprise, and it's not kind of what you think about when you think about religion and religious adherence. And, of course, what it ended up being there is a story about how, in many cases, religion is a proxy for politics, and religion and politics are proxies for each other. And the most religious people they tend to be the most conservative people, and the most conservative people tend to be the most okay with using torture, other extreme methods to extract information from criminal suspects. So that was kind of a real, kind of that's where a piece of data turned my expectations on their head. But it was also a good reminder that you can't look at a piece of data in isolation. The finding that religious people love torture, that's a shocking finding. But it's not the whole story. The whole story is the religion is a proxy for conservatism, and conservative people are much more comfortable with the idea of torture than people of other political beliefs.
Right, and there's something about a sense of justice that works into that, and there's maybe a religious underpinning to this idea of ultimate justice, and I could see where those things start kind of toppling out from there.
Yeah.
Interesting. There's another piece of data that factors greatly into your personal story and then ultimately the story of this book. If you lived here, you'd be home by now. But before we get specifically into that, you guys were you were working in Washington, D.C., but not living in the district, right? You were living outside there?
Yeah, that's correct. So we were living in Baltimore County because that's where we could afford housing, and I was commuting into D.C. every day. So it was hour and a half one way, so 3 hours a day, 15 hours a week. I ended up tallying it all up, and it was something like over a month of full calendar days in a given year I spent commuting. So like more than 1/12 of my entire life, waking and sleeping hours, I was commuting on the train. So it was, it was okay. Like a lot of people out there do that, and you can rationalize it for a long time. But for me, when our kids came along, we ended up having twins, and that's when I started to really feel like those were lost hours that I needed to get back somehow.
So what did you do at that time? If you're spending, that huge chunk of time commuting on a train, what do you do to redeem that time? Anything?
That time is largely irredeemable. The problem is, like, it was across multiple modes of transit. So I'd leave the house, I would drive to the train station, I would get on the train, I would hop off the train, I would get on the subway, I would take the subway to a different stop, and then I'd walk the last 3 blocks. So it wasn't like it was just 90 minutes of uninterrupted time. It was these constant interruptions, all these junctures where something could go wrong, and if I missed a connection, then my commute balloons from 1.5 hours to 3 hours. So, a lot of people, and I hear people say, oh, well, if it's a long commute, but you can do work or whatever, and my experience has been, no, I don't think I did a single piece of productive work during that time on the train. The most I got to do was goof off on the internet for 15 minutes maybe before I was waiting to make my next connection or fretting about some delay I had. So, I mean, if you look at survey data and you ask people, like, what are their favorite and least favorite things to do during the day, commute is absolutely 100% dead last on people's list. They would literally rather scrub toilets than commute. People hate their commutes. And a weird fact about American life today is that our commutes just keep getting longer.
Yeah. There's something seriously wrong when you have to live that far away from where you work just to afford to live there.
Yeah, and that's that's a huge problem on the East Coast in so many of our cities. New housing, new construction, new infrastructure is simply not keeping pace with the rising population. And for a long time, I think city life was, it was a great deal for lots of just typical workers because wages were rising and cities were building and, it didn't become overwhelming. But, in the past couple decades, wages have been getting flatter. Nobody's building anything. Housing prices are just going through the roof, and nobody can afford it anymore. So people are moving farther and farther out. They're sacrificing more and more time. They're seeing less of their families. They're doing less work in the office because time that they might have otherwise spent in the office, they're now sitting on the train or sitting on the car. It's really a terrible situation for everyone involved.
Right. So in the midst of this feeling that you're having, this constant frustration with the commute, you stumble upon, or maybe not stumble, I don't remember exactly how you came on it, but you come across this data set. And I totally stumbled across it. So
okay. This is a data set that was put together in 1999, actually, by the United States Department of Agriculture. And I only happened to find it because I saw a press release about a new study into something or other that drew on that data set as like a secondary kind of factor. And so I was reading, I was like, Natural Amenities Index, what on earth is this? And so I go and look it up, and what had happened is in the late 90s, USDA researchers, they're trying to understand better migration patterns, particularly migration from rural areas to more urban ones. And obviously, jobs and economic considerations are one of those factors. But they suspected that there were physical factors as well, physical characteristics of a place. So think... So what they tried to do is quantify all the things that make a place what we might think of as a nice place to live. So, low humidity, mild winters, lots of sunshine, lots of hills and valleys, bodies of water and shoreline. And they took all these factors together, and they kind of put them all in a big statistical blender, and then it spit out basically these rankings for every single county in the United States on these physical characteristics.
Gotcha. So, being the writer that you are, and someone who has a bit of a wry sense of humor, you decide to write a story and about this data set and things that you've learned from it. And in that story, you, drum roll please, name the absolute worst place to live in America. When you decided to write that, we all have done things and said things, and sometimes you immediately know after you've said it or done it, sent it off where it's no longer, reachable. You immediately go, oh man, I wonder if that was the right decision to do that. And sometimes you're just oblivious to the fallout and the outcomes of this thing. Where were you when you wrote this piece and it went out to the world?
So I was completely oblivious. So I do this kind of thing every single day. It's like my bread and butter, like finding interesting data sets that look at counties, that rank them by like economic or social characteristics or what have you. And so there's kind of a standard way to write these stories. Like, I would make a map of it, and everyone wants to know, like, what's the number one place on the list. So, like, according to this particular USDA data set, it was Ventura, California, where you have that nice Mediterranean climate and the ocean and everything. And then, this weird little place I'd never heard of called Red Lake County, Minnesota, ends up dead last. And I need to find something to say about this place, right? Because people are going to ask about it. So I started Googling, and there's like no information anywhere. Like, this county does not have an internet footprint at all, hardly. I finally find their county website. It's like this, and it just comes across to me as like this dopey little Midwestern community. They've got like a community calendar that's like 2 years old.
It's like an old GeoCity site or something.
Yeah, exactly. Something exactly like that. I'm like, oh man, okay, like this is just kind of in the middle of nowhere. These people are never going to read this, so whatever. I'll just mention this line in here, have a bit of fun with them. And I kind of sent it out, and I was like, all right, kind of, wash my hands of it and on to the next story. But the weird thing that happened in this case is that almost immediately I started getting feedback from all over the state of Minnesota, not just from people in Red Lake County, but from people all over the state who were like, whoa, what do you mean? Our state is beautiful. It is impossible that the ugliest place in America could be anywhere in Minnesota. What is going on here?
It's so funny because I went and pulled that data set that you're talking about, the 1999 one, and the community that I live in or near in South Mississippi probably ranks pretty close to that one in Minnesota. We're recording this on September 25th at about 2:30 in the afternoon, and the thermometer temperature right now is 100 degrees.
Oh my God!
Not counting the heat index. It's 85% humidity here today. So it's so what you learn pretty quickly though is that the numbers don't always reflect deeper things, deeper connections, and things that make a community that can't be quantized. I don't know the word I'm looking for, but what did you, as you started getting this feedback from people, what was your reaction, and how did you decide to respond to that?
Well, the weird thing was, like, so I've done these stories, like, all the time, and, okay, so you're from Mississippi, right? Okay, so prepare your listeners. I'm going to have a little bit of fun here at Mississippi's expense.
Oh, yeah.
But there's this saying among statisticians you're probably familiar with, which is "Thank God for Mississippi," and the idea being that no matter how poorly one place may rank on something like economics or cultural or what have you, Mississippi always ranks worse because Mississippi or Alabama, depending on who you're talking to, Mississippi or Alabama, they're always at the bottom of the list. And so I've written plenty of horrible sentences about Mississippi and Alabama over the course of my career. Not a single peep ever from folks in those states.
But they kind of expect it.
Yeah, I guess they're like, I don't know, whatever, another idiot from the East Coast writing something bad about us. But like people in Minnesota, they really took offense to it, and I came to understand that Minnesota is in many ways kind of like the Texas of the North. Like we know don't mess with Texas, but there's a real like don't mess with Minnesota. There's a very strong sense of state pride up there. So, I started getting this feedback, and, people are, like, sending me pictures of the area and things like that, and, like, local news outlets are writing on it. Politicians are getting into it. Senator Amy Klobuchar spent, like, half an afternoon, like, sending me photos on Facebook being like, look at this, you idiot. What is wrong with you? How could you possibly say this thing? And it got to a point where, like, and this was, mind you, this is August in D.C., so, like, the city is dead. There's nothing going on. There's no real news to report on. And it got to a point where we were kind of like, man, it'll be interesting now. Like, now I'm really curious. Like, now I kind of want to go out and see what this place is actually like, given that so many people are so upset about it. And I ended up getting that opportunity because a few days after the original story, this guy who lives in Red Lake Falls, he shoots me an email, and he's like, hey, I own a business here. We've been reading your story with some amusement. We think it would be great if you actually came out to visit, so I'd like to invite you. We'll show you around. You can take a look at the place, and you can do a follow-up story. And I was like, that might be a cool idea.
A real Red Lake ambassador.
Yes, exactly, yeah. And so, I kind of like, the first thing I did is I told my wife, I'm like, hey, those people in that weird county, they want me to come up and visit. And she's like, are you kidding me? They're going to kill you. Do not go out there. Like, they're going to, like, put your head on a pike. And then, I ended up pitching it to my editors, and my editors are like, yeah, go out there and see what happens. Like, because I'm sure they were thinking, like, reporter gets killed by polite Midwestern mob would have been a great August story for them to run. So they, in the end, they ended up sending me out there, and I spent a couple days out there just kind of soaking the place in and meeting people and really getting an on-the-ground view of this stuff that, by definition, you can't see when you were just looking at a cell in a spreadsheet thousands of miles away.
Right. So you go to visit, you get the kind of the lay of the land and the people. Then something weird starts to happen. Did this happen when you get back and start having conversations with your wife? I mean, you guys ultimately move there. Mm-hmm. How does all this start unfolding? What's the step by step that you never could have seen ahead of time?
Yeah, well, it started happening as soon as I got there on that first visit, and like I had no idea what to expect really. Like being from upstate New York, my frame of reference was kind of small upstate New York towns, which many of them have a very kind of Rust Belt kind of feel. There's a real sense that like people are struggling. There's a real sense of despair that opportunities have left. This is kind of a rural narrative we hear about a lot. So that was kind of my frame of reference. But I get out there. And I was just struck by like, these in these towns up here in the Upper Midwest, there are challenges obviously, and people are having their difficulties, but there's a real sense that people are rising up to meet those challenges, and they're overcoming them, and they are kind of proactively working still to make their communities better places to live. In ways that they aren't in upstate New York where I'm from, because people just, people in upstate New York, they're so focused on just surviving, on making it to the next day, that they can't think ahead to figure out how to make things better. Out here in northern Minnesota, very different feel, just tons of pride in the community, real sense of social cohesion. And that was really striking to me, not just with the contrast with upstate New York, but also with where we were in Baltimore and D.C., which is just kind of, your typical large, faceless urban area where, you just get lost in the crowd, right? And nobody knows each other. And everything, it's hard to get around, and everything is very regimented. And so the contrast between the way people appeared to be living out here and the way my wife and I were living back in D.C. became, immediately apparent once I got here. And when I got back, I started talking to her about these things, and I'm a dad guy. I'm not exactly a people person, but I came back like raving about the people and the sense of the community and whatever. My wife is like, who are you? Like, did they brainwash you out there or something? Like, what is going on? And so, that contrast hit us right at the time that we were really struggling with the DC stuff, with the quality of life, the cost of living. We just couldn't figure out how to make the numbers work. We had two twins. They were 2 years old. We were living in an 800-square-foot row house, spread across 4 stories, by the way. So it was just like this tower of stairs. Our house was a death trap for toddlers. So we needed to move, but we couldn't afford to go anywhere. We couldn't go closer to D.C. It was too expensive. We couldn't go farther out because I was already commuting 3 hours a day. We were stuck. It was tearing our family apart, and we were like, man, something has to change, but we just could not figure out how to make the numbers work where we were.
So there are certain things on the surface that immediately look better for moving away from the city. Your commute time is not what it was. The cost of living is lower. There's this tight-knit community. Lots of things look good on the surface. What were some of the drawbacks that you knew you were going to miss, or things that you were going to have to struggle with by moving away from the life that you knew?
Yeah, so, we worried a bit. There was the worry about, what are you going to do out there? There's nothing to do in the middle of nowhere. It's just corn. And so, we were kind of worried about, what are we going to do with our kids? And, how are we going to entertain them? And, we knew we would miss being close to, the museums and the aquarium and all that kind of cool stuff in D.C. and Baltimore. The weird thing was, though, that, when and I've talked to a lot of people who live in cities like this, they're like, yeah, there's all this cool stuff around us, but, either we don't have the time or we don't have the money to do it. Because, getting anywhere, getting from our house to the aquarium on the weekend in Baltimore was just a huge undertaking. It would take, an hour and a half to get from outside of Baltimore to down the city. And, by then, the kids are screaming and they're angry. And, so, in the cities, you're surrounded by these amenities. But especially for families with young children, it can be really hard to take advantage of those. So we knew we would have to, kind of work more to find things to do for the kids. But on the same time, we also knew that we simply weren't able to take advantage to what was available to us in the cities. Another thing I think that we knew we would be missing is diversity. Baltimore and D.C., very ethnically, religiously, culturally diverse place. It's just in the air you breathe out there, right? You walk down the street and you see people from other cultures and speaking different languages and passing different restaurants. And we knew we'd be coming out here to what is essentially this monoculture where it's 96% white, right? And so we knew that if, we knew that we would have to make an effort to help our boys understand that, yes, this is Northwest Minnesota. It's a very special corner of the world, but it is part of a much bigger world. And we knew we were going to have to make an effort to help them see that and to expose them, to really go out of our way to expose them to diversity in a way that we wouldn't have had to do if we had stayed in D.C.
Yeah. Well, and what you learned pretty quickly, when you move to a place like Minnesota, or if you move to rural Mississippi, is that there are differences in culture that you see on the news and things like that. There are red states, blue states. There are different religious affiliations and preferences and all of these things. But when you move to a small town, one thing that you discover pretty quickly is that one of the biggest divides in our culture is rural versus urban, or country versus city. What was that realization like for you, and how have you guys adjusted and adapted?
Yeah, well, so one of the funny things coming out here, so we came out here, before we actually moved here, we came out here in March of 2016 to try to find a place to live. And keep in mind, this is completely rural area. Red Lake County is 4,000 people maybe total. The town we live in, Red Lake Falls, is 1,400 people. But we noticed that people kept making a real big distinction when talking about places to live between houses in town versus houses out in the country. And we're like, what are you talking about? This entire place is the country. There's you guys must be crazy. But after living here for a couple of years, we're like, oh, I get it. In town here, there are other people. Whereas if you're out in the country, you're kind of off the grid and you're responsible for all of your own stuff. I'll say on the broader rural-urban divide, I think a lot of time our national media doesn't do a great job of reporting on it. Honestly, I think a lot of time it's overstated. One of the things I was surprised about coming out here was just, from a political standpoint at least, how relatively politically diverse it was. Like, you get the sense reading the news that, like, outside of every major city, it's just Trump country, and like everybody out there is a Trump voter, and everybody's Republican, and they all have guns and drive pickup trucks or whatever. But and that's like, there's an extent to which that's true. Like, Red Lake County, I think, voted 2-1 for Trump in 2016. But that means that like a third of the county out here are these like rural progressive people, and there are rural Democrats and progressive people in rural areas whose stories are almost completely untold by the national media. And so, I would hear a lot from people in cities like, oh, it'd be nice to get out of the city, but I don't think I could live, in red America or whatever. And I'm like, it doesn't feel like red America. It just feels like America out here. Like, if you want to go talk to Trump voters, you can find Trump voters. If you want to find
the picture already.
More liberal people, you can easily find more liberal people.
He stood with one arm around the bronze waist of the bewitched tribute statue.
Samantha Stevens,
riding a broom across a crescent moon.
So
Jason tried in vain to frame the shot without any tourists in it. That was impossible. From all points of the compass, a merry horde had arrived for Salem's 2-day summer psychic fair.
And
all
and
the commuter
the
trains had burst open, like cornucopias filled beyond capacity, spilling endless fruits and nuts onto the red brick sidewalks of Essex Street. A vampirist in lavender shorts and
when you're not a news
sold
junkie,
maple
some of those
chocolate
things are just
walnut
not
fudge
as
in front of
important.
the Wick City tattoo parlor.
Everyone's trying to survive and
a near-naked
provide a good life
gypsy
for
in
their
purple
family.
green
And we may
veils
have
danced
differences
with
in
a
how we
pheasant in
go
her
about
arms
that,
around
but
a
some of those
plug-in
things just
Hanukkah
don't
menorah.
matter as much as
A fat
people would
man in
like
a
to
fetching
pretend
blue
that they
jeans
do.
dress
Yeah,
sold
and I have
amethyst
to
and
say that is
citrine charm
honestly one of my
bracelets in front of
favorite
Medusa
parts
Cafe.
about living
But his
out
stand
here
got
is
knocked
that
over by a one-armed
politics
crone
are-
driving a
they're
mobility
part of
scooter who
people's
sang
identity out
"Choo
here,
choo"
but it is
as
by
she
no
passed.
means all of
Her
people's
stump on the
identity.
wheel,
Like, politics
her
is
lipstick
something
ghastly,
that happens in the
her gnarled
background,
right
and there,
hand
there are
raised and trailing
controversies
plumes
and
of noxious
disagreements,
cigarette smoke.
But like,
Chewbacca leapt out of her
discussion,
way and
largely
slapped
the
sparks from
politics
his
gets
fur.
out of the way so that
He
people
gave a
can go
disgruntled
about
growl
living their
before going
lives,
back
and
to
I think
playing Summer
that's a
Lovin' on
really
his
healthy way
ukulele.
to live. I think that that's the way the politics
The old
should
one-armed
work in this
dervish
country. I
drove
don't think it
off,
should be this
choo-choo,
all-consuming
parting a crowd of
24/7,
wanderers,
just
slack-jawed
controversy,
tourists with
five-alarm
camera
fire.
straps tight across their
And
bellies,
unfortunately,
yellow-vested
in
police on
the cities, and
segways,
at least most of the
elderly
places where
rollerbladers,
I've lived,
face-painted
it
infants,
gets
and harried
treated
parents,
that way.
and
But
college
out here,
girls.
it's very quiet.
So
like, during
many
the
hot,
election, you would
hysterical
hardly know
college
there was an
girls that you'd
election
think
out here in
somebody had
2016, 'cause
napalmed
there
a
just weren't
sorority
whole lot
house.
of, signs
Jason,
or bumper stickers
are you
or
deaf?
anything like that.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Jason raised the
Well,
phone and took the shot.
the new book, if you
Joey
lived here, you'd
inspected
be
the
home
photo
by
and
now,
nodded
is
in
this
approval.
great exploration
Your turn.
of the data.
No, thanks.
But
Do it,
also
Shaggy.
your
Don't
experience
make me hex
with it.
you.
So it's this
Jason
mixture
gave in
of
and traded
kind of
places.
deconstructing
He put an
what
arm
this
around
means,
Samantha's metal back.
and giving us a
bronze
glimpse
body had
into
flushed in the
your
afternoon
experience
sun,
with it, and,
warm through his glove,
what you
but
and
her
your
eyes
family
were weary.
have gone through, and you highlight some
downright
really great
creepy.
things in the book.
And her
One
smile
of those,
was
and
forced,
talking about
like a
politics,
Disneyland
that we just
princess
were,
who'd had her
one
toes
interesting
stomped.
thing about the place where you live, and I
Say
think this
chowder,
goes for a lot of
cried Joey,
places,
who'd
is
been
that there's this
practicing his
really
New England
interesting
accent all
divide
morning.
in national
on,
politics
man.
and local
Say
politics.
chowder.
Can you talk about that for just a minute?
Fine.
What you've noticed?
Chowder.
Yeah, well,
Joey got the shot, and Jason surrendered
national
Samantha
politics,
to a
like, we all know
chubby kid
national
wearing a
politics, like
Gandalf
anybody who's
beard
ever turned
who
on
climbed
cable
up to
news,
worship
like,
her bronze
like
bosom.
5 minutes of cable news and you understand what's going on in national politics, because it's just people screaming about the same stuff over and over. Out here, it's very different. There's less of it. Part of it is, out here, when people want to get something done, they just kind of get together and do it. And so one of the examples here in Red Lake Falls is, people one year, they decided that the town should have a pool. So, rather than go through city council and the mayor and try to levy tax increases or do a ballot measure or whatever, they're just we're just going to get together, we're going to raise some money, we're going to get the permits, we're going to do this. And that's exactly what they did. And I think you have to have a lot more of that in these smaller areas where there are, less in the way of social services, government services. When people want stuff, it kind of forces you to come together to make that happen. And that another really healthy thing, I think, about that is that there are much more opportunities and even a requirement, I'd say, for people to get involved in politics at the local level. And not even just politics, but just in, community service, just because there are so many things that need to get done. Out in Baltimore, like, everything was professionalized, right? Like, you have your politicians, and they handle everything. And, if you want to get involved, it's kind of like, well, get in line, and we'll see if we'll let you volunteer for X, Y, or Z. But you come out here to a place like this, and you just get inundated with requests like, hey, can you join the board of this? We need people to do that. Or can you help us figure out how to do this thing? And that's been great for my wife in particular, because she's a real people person. She has a background in the government, so she's been really involved out here in government. And she ended up actually running for city council last year and winning. She ran unopposed, so she got something like 99.8% of the vote, like real Saddam Hussein style margin of victory. But now she's out here and she's making decisions that affect the future of this community. And that's something that you can't. It's much harder to be able to get that level of involvement in a big city where there's just millions and millions of people.
Well, in a big city, something like community service takes on this nebulous sort of air where you are serving unknown people for sometimes an unknown purpose. And in a small community service means the people that you know by name. And that really does make a difference.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. There's in a small community, there's just a lot more trust because everybody knows each other and everybody knows each other's business, which is kind of a two-edged sword, but it's it makes it easier to get things done. And, yeah, exactly like you said, when I, give money to something in a larger metro area, it just kind of goes into this black hole and who knows what it's going to get used for. But out here, there's a certain amount of transparency that comes just because, you can see the effects of what's going on right before you.
Another thing that is a real hot-button issue all across our country is gun ownership. Mm-hmm. And you talk about in the book that gun ownership in your community there in Minnesota is high, mm-hmm. But gun violence is very low. Mm-hmm. What do you attribute to that after being in this community?
Yeah, and again, I think I look at this in a similar way that I look at politics. I remember in Maryland, for a lot of people who owned guns, owning guns was a big part of their identity, and they have these Second Amendment bumper stickers, and they flying these flags outside their house with AR-15s and come and get it and all that, and it's just this, kind of in suburban Maryland, right? Come on, man, give me a break. Whereas out here, everybody owns guns, but they don't base who they are upon their guns. Guns are tools, right? And maybe you have a rifle for hunting and you've got a pistol for self-defense or something for target shooting, and it's something that you have, but it's a hammer or a saw or whatever, and I'm not going to go put a bumper sticker on my car about how much I love my hammer. It's just people are very pragmatic about it out here. And again, it's a real healthy way, I think, of looking at these issues where you look at it from a practical standpoint. What is a gun? It's a piece of metal that fires other pieces of metal, and you don't need to, get kind of, I guess, all up in arms over it. It's just something you have. It's something that you need for certain things, and that's fine. And nobody, really raises much of a stink about it.
Well, I guess the, and a part of this discussion becomes, how do we then rationalize a small section of the country, where the District of Columbia, that then sets all of these rules and expectations for the rest of the country and all of these disparate little communities. It kind of lets you see just how kind of out of touch that all is, and then knowing that, what can we do to bring some sense back to the centralized government and how we then treat one another in this great big country that we have. It's kind of an insane type of government for as big a place as we live in.
Yeah, it really is. And, one of the things I find myself, like, the longer I spend out here, first of all, like, it's like impossible for me to envision ourselves moving back to D.C. at this point. And second, I find myself just getting much more frustrated with the political process in D.C. Because, like, when I was out there working out there every day, like, you kind of, like, internalize all these notions about how it works. And you're like, well, we can't do certain things because there's, these structural reasons, and you can't just do that. And then kind of you step away and you get outside that for a bit, and you're like, that doesn't make sense. Like, there's no reason this shouldn't be able to work. And so, I think a lot of it boils down to questions of representation, and we have some real problems with representation. And, particularly one thing that I've written about a lot about is, redistricting and gerrymandering, and we have politicians, and it's politicians on both sides who do this, who are, drawing districts in such a way to give themselves an advantage. So you have these crazy situations where you have, like, in like Pennsylvania, statewide Republican representatives got something like, 40% of the vote, but they ended up taking 75% of the House seats. So there's a lot of kind of shenanigans going on within D.C. that's spilling over, and it's really preventing people in all these far-flung, disparate places from all sorts of political persuasions from really, enacting the policies they prefer. There's this kind of idea in D.C. right now that, like, oh, well, if a majority of people want something, well, that doesn't mean it's going to happen. That's just not the way it works. And, out here I kind of step back and think, like, well, if like 2/3 of people want a certain thing and D.C. is just not moving on it, that suggests there's some real problems with how we have representation set up. And, I worry about that going forward, what kind of frustrations that will eventually boil over into.
So you guys moved to Minnesota around 2016, is that right?
That's correct, yep.
So have you been there long enough yet that you've called someone an elitist East Coaster yet?
I do it to my coworkers all the time just to kind of rankle them. And also one of my other favorite things is that if I'm online on social media or whatever and somebody's taking umbrage with one of my stories and they try to dismiss me as an elitist East Coaster, I can pull I live in a town of 1,400 people in the middle of nowhere card, and it's very satisfying to do that as a reporter, let me tell you.
Oh, yeah. I'll tell you. The new book is called If You Lived Here, You'd Be Home by Now, Why We Traded the Commuting Life for a Little House on the Prairie. Christopher, I absolutely love this book. I love your personal take on this really important issue. And I love the way that you tell the story of it. If people are just learning about you, is there a place where they can find you online and connect and read all about the stuff that you do?
Yeah, you can just, so I'm on Twitter way more than I should be. My Twitter username is _C Ingram, INGRAHAM. And you can also find my stories on the Washington Post. I think if you just Google my name, my Post author page is the first thing that comes up, and all of my stories are on there. But yeah, I do definitely spend way more time online than I should. So I'm out there. So drop me a line, say hi, and I hope if you decide to check out the book, I hope you enjoy it.
One more question for you. When you have a story that was just a run-of-the-mill daily story that you do that then wound up impacting your life the way this one has, does that change the way you look at news story ideas? Are you more sensitive to things now, or just not at all?
One thing I'll say is that I'm much more careful in how I characterize groups of people now. In the past when I was in D.C., I would write statements about, say, gun owners or Republicans or, pick a demographic group. This group says or believes X, Y, or Z. Now I really think about that because I'm like, well, my neighbor down the street, he's a gun owner and a Republican, and if he reads a sentence, like, what is he going to think about that? Is that going to strike him as an accurate sentence or not? And if not, maybe I need to kind of be a little more careful and a little more precise. So I find myself being much more precise in my language right now than I used to be, and I think that's a really good thing for my reporting and just for reporting in general.
Yeah. Well, I absolutely love the book, Christopher. We're going to send everyone to pick up a copy of it and to connect with you online. We'll put links to everything in the show notes of this episode. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks to Christopher Ingraham for joining me today. Be sure to check out his work in the show notes of this episode. Now stay tuned for a special audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series.